Hola, estudiantes. I just wanted to go over the two different moods that we're dealing with, as well as the two different tenses or time periods that we're dealing with, just so you don't get confused. Now, we've talked about using weirdo or Spock for indicative versus subjunctive, right? And we know that weirdo is for subjunctive, and we know that Spock is for indicative. But we also, in addition to choosing between subjunctive and indicative, we can choose between present or past. So, I just want to review those tenses really quick so that you don't get confused. So if I decide that I want to use subjunctive in a sentence because I see a weirdo clause, like espero que or dudo que, then I have to decide if the second part of the sentence is in the present or if it's in the past. If it's in the present, and it were the verb hablar, for example, I might say something like, espero que tú hables conmigo. But if it were in the past, I might say something like, espero que tú hayas hablado con la maestra. Now, if I decide that I see a Spock indicator and I'm going to use the indicative, I can talk about that in the present or in the past. So I might see something like, creo que tú hablas demasiado. Or if it was in the past, I might say something like, creo que tú has hablado mucho. So, the names of these four tenses that I'm talking about, the first tense is called the present subjunctive. The second tense I was talking about is called the present perfect subjunctive. If I were to have named the tense, I would have called it the past subjunctive. But what we have learned and what the grammarians have called this tense is the present perfect subjunctive. The third tense I was talking about is called the present indicative. And the fourth tense is called the present perfect. I think if I named the tense, I would have called it the indicative in the past. But the grammarians call it the present perfect tense. So, this chart isn't in order of how you learned them. You actually learned the present indicative in Spanish 1. That was the first tense that you learned. So think things like o, as, a, amos, an for AR verbs, o, es, e, mos, en for ER and IR verbs. Of course, you have a whole bunch of irregulars in there like tengo, soy, eres, es, somos, son, and so on. The next tense you learned was the present subjunctive, and you learned that earlier in the year in Spanish 3. So you can always look back in your notes and find it. But the general rules of the present subjunctive, step 1, you go to the yo. Step 2, you drop the o. Step 2b, you check for cargar zar. And step 3, you do the opposite vowel. So a verb like hablar would be tú hables, or correr would be tú corras. Then you learned the present perfect. You learned this at the end of Spanish 2 if you were in honors, and we also learned it again in Spanish 3. And that tense is where you start off with the participle, you end with the participle, but you start off with the forms of haber in the present tense. So like has, ha, hemos, han, and so on. And remember the participles, the ARs go to ado, the ERs and the IRs go to ido, and then you have all the irregulars, abierto, dicho, hecho, puesto, and so on. And then we learn the present perfect subjunctive, also in Spanish 3. And this one's pretty similar to the present perfect indicative in the fact that it has the forms of haber plus a participle. But the forms of haber are the forms of haber in the subjunctive. So like haya, hayas, haya, hayamos, hayais, hayan. And then the participles are the same. AR, ER, auto, ido, and the irregulars with the song that we know. So I just wanted to make that video to clarify what those 4 tenses are. You know all 4 of those tenses, but you've probably never seen them all together like this. I hope that helps. Hasta luego.